The camera opens on the soft hum of an airport terminal. Naples, 1962. People shuffle past a man in a tailored suit, older now, his once sharp eyes dulled by years of exile. He bends slightly to shake a visitor's hand, and in that instant, his heart gives out. The man collapses on the polished floor. A moment of silence follows, confused faces, startled gasps, and then whispers ripple through the crowd. That's Lucky Luciano. It's a death as quiet as it is poetic. No bullets, no blood, no police chase. Just the silent fall of a man who once ruled an invisible empire stretching from New York to Havana. As his body is carried away, history seems to pause, uncertain how to bury a man whose reach never truly ended. Because what died that day wasn't his power, only its owner. From the slums of Sicily to the glittering skyline of Manhattan, Lucky Luciano had done what no one before him dared to imagine. He made crime make sense. He organized chaos, tamed anarchy, and built a structure that still pulses beneath modern society, invisible, methodical, alive. What he created was not merely a network of criminals but a blueprint, a silent system of order and profit, mimicking the very world that condemned it. The story of Charles Lucky Luciano isn't one of simple villainy. It's a story of vision and ruthlessness, of intellect wrapped in cold calculation. He was the man who understood people like a scientist dissects an organism, measuring fear, greed, and loyalty as though they were currencies. He didn't want to be a king. He wanted to build a kingdom that could survive without him. To understand Luciano is to understand the American underworld itself, its rise from the immigrant ghettos, its seduction by wealth and respect, and its strange reflection of capitalism's own mechanics. Behind every corrupt union, every silent handshake, every business decision, made in a smoky backroom, there echoes the logic he left behind. But this story is not simply about power. It's about what power does to a man who believes he can control everything: loyalty, betrayal, even destiny. Luciano's genius was his structure, but his curse was believing it could last forever. Because no matter how perfect the system, humanity, with its greed and ego, always finds a way to fracture it. As the credits of his life rolled across that airport floor, the empire he built didn't die. It adapted. It spread. The commission he founded still whispers in boardrooms and back alleys, its principles copied by corporate moguls and cartel leaders alike. Lucky Luciano may have vanished, but his blueprint, his vision of power, remains hidden in plain sight. And so, this story begins not at the moment of his birth, but at the moment of his death, the final breath of a man whose ideas proved immortal. To trace his rise is to map the DNA of organized crime itself. To understand his fall is to confront the nature of ambition, and how far one man will go to shape the world in his image, even if that world exists in the shadows. Because in the end, Lucky Luciano didn't just build an empire. He built a system that never died. Long before Lucky Luciano reshaped the criminal underworld into a corporate machine, America's streets were ruled by chaos. It was the early 1900s, a land of opportunity and desperation colliding in every alleyway. The immigrant waves from Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe flooded New York City, each bringing dreams of survival and their own versions of law and loyalty. For many, the promise of the American dream was nothing more than a cruel joke written in another man's language. Work was scarce, wages were starvation, and respect was reserved for the powerful, or the brutal. In the tenement blocks of Lower Manhattan, crime wasn't a profession, it was survival. Gangs sprouted like weeds, the 5 Points Gang, the Eastmans, the Wyos, each claiming pieces of territory with knives and fists. These were not organizations. They were chaotic clusters of young men bound by ethnicity and hunger. Loyalty lasted only until someone offered a bigger cut. The Italian Black Hand gangs terrorized their own communities, shaking down poor immigrants with crude letters scrawled in blood-red ink, threatening kidnapping or death. It was crime without structure, power without purpose. The police were no saviors. Corruption ran through the system like rot through wood. Detectives and politicians pocketed bribes from saloon owners, pimps, and bootleggers, turning blind eyes to murder and extortion. The city was a carnival of vice, with every neighborhood its own fiefdom of fear. To the common man, justice was something you couldn't afford, and protection was something you had to buy. Then came Prohibition. When the 18th Amendment outlawed alcohol in 1920, America handed criminals their golden ticket. Overnight, liquor became more valuable than gold. Saloons went underground, morphing into speakeasies. Bootleggers turned into businessmen. The underworld smelled opportunity, but it was still a battlefield. Irish gangs fought the Italians. Italians fought the Jews. The Jews fought everyone. Bullets replaced negotiations, and betrayal was the only real language spoken. This was the world Luciano inherited, a violent ecosystem with no rules, where alliances were as fragile as glass and every boss ruled like a medieval lord. Sicilian traditions of omerta and family loyalty clashed with the American appetite for profit and expansion. The old-world mafia, with its codes and rituals, couldn't survive in the industrial chaos of modern New York. It was too rigid, too slow, too romantic for a city that never slept. Luciano saw it clearly, even as a young man watching the carnage unfold around him. The problem wasn't the greed, it was the lack of order. He recognized that the underworld suffered from the same disease as legitimate business before the age of corporations: fragmentation. Everyone wanted to rule, but no one knew how to organize. To Luciano, this chaos wasn't a warning, it was an opportunity. He studied the streets like a strategist studies a battlefield, observing patterns in the madness. He saw how loyalty could be bought, how respect could be negotiated, and how fear could be systematized. While others were fighting for blocks, Luciano was already imagining networks. This was the crucible that forged his vision, a vision that crime could be something more than random violence. It could be structured, efficient, profitable. The future king of the underworld began not with power, but with observation, seeing the failures of those who came before him and understanding that to survive, he'd have to turn chaos into design. And so, before there was a commission, before there was a mafia as we know it, there was only disorder, a raw and brutal landscape waiting for someone to impose order. That someone was Charles "Lucky" Luciano. But first, he would have to rise from the same gutters that swallowed thousands before him, and prove that intelligence could conquer brutality, and that even crime could be civilized, if only in appearance. He was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897, in the small Sicilian town of Lercara Fritti, a place where the air smelled of dust, sweat, and survival. His family lived under the shadow of poverty, like most in southern Italy. His father, Antonio, was a humble sulfur miner who dreamed of something better for his children. That dream carried them across the Atlantic when Salvatore was just 9 years old, landing in the teeming chaos of New York City's Lower East Side. The neighborhood was a living organism, noisy, overcrowded, and alive with ambition and despair in equal measure. Here, survival wasn't about strength alone, it was about cunning. Streets buzzed with hustlers, pickpockets, gamblers, and immigrants fighting for the smallest piece of a city that didn't want them. For young Lucania, this was school, and the lessons were brutal. He learned that respect had to be taken, not given. At first, he tried to fit into the American system. His father wanted him to work hard, to study, to become something respectable. But the system wasn't built for boys like him. He barely spoke English, was mocked for his accent, and soon found that school offered no protection, but the streets did. By his early teens, he was running errands for local gangsters, carrying messages, watching doorways, learning the rhythms of power in the underworld. He began to drift toward the 5 Points Gang, one of the most feared and organized street groups in the city. Its leader, Paul Kelly, born Paolo Vaccarelli, was one of the first to mix ethnic lines in organized crime, bringing Italians, Irish, and Jews together for mutual profit. Kelly saw something in young Luciano, not just ambition but intelligence. Luciano watched how Kelly operated: calm, strategic, respectful when needed, ruthless when not. It was a lesson that would define his entire philosophy. As he grew older, he became known for 2 traits: charm and composure. Even his enemies noticed it. He wasn't the kind of gangster who shouted or bragged. He preferred conversation, deals made in whispers rather than threats. His friends began calling him Lucky, partly for surviving several near-death encounters, and partly because things seemed to fall into place for him. But those who knew him best said his luck was really something else: calculation. He saw outcomes before others did, reading situations like chess moves. One of those early moves was his unlikely friendship with Meyer Lansky, a Jewish kid from the same rough neighborhoods. Lansky was quiet, brilliant with numbers, and equally ambitious. In an era when ethnic lines defined everything, their alliance was revolutionary. Together they understood something no one else did: that crime, like business, thrived when cooperation replaced tribalism. They didn't care about Sicilian bloodlines or immigrant codes, they cared about profit, efficiency, and respect. Luciano also crossed paths with Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, a volatile and fearless young gangster who would later become one of his most loyal soldiers. With Lansky's brains, Siegel's aggression, and Luciano's strategy, they formed what would later be called the Young Turks of organized crime, a new generation that rejected the old-world hierarchies and aimed to modernize the underworld. But street life came with its dangers. In 1923, Luciano was kidnapped by rival gangsters, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on Staten Island. He survived barely. The attack left him with a permanently drooping right eyelid and several facial scars, giving him that distinctive, slightly tilted expression that would become iconic. Many thought it broke him. In reality, it transformed him. When he re-emerged, his new face carried the mark of invincibility. He had seen death and walked away. That brush with mortality cemented his philosophy. Violence was a tool, not a language. It was to be used sparingly, to make a point, to seal authority, but never as the foundation of power. The real power came from influence, alliances, and structure. He understood that fear might win you battles, but respect built empires. By his mid-20s, Lucky Luciano was already weaving connections between the city's major crime figures: Italians, Jews, Irish, and even corrupt politicians. He moved easily between them, speaking the universal language of opportunity. While others clung to tradition, he spoke of organization, networks, and profit-sharing. It was during these years that Luciano began to dream of something bigger. A world where crime wasn't an endless cycle of street wars but an empire with order and strategy. To him, the underworld didn't have to remain primitive. It could evolve like any other business. He was still young, but his mind had already moved beyond the small-time hustles of the Lower East Side. He wasn't thinking about one block or one gang, he was thinking about a system. What began as survival in the slums was turning into something visionary. The boy from Lercora Fritti was about to become the architect of a new criminal order, one that would change the face of organized crime forever. By the late 1920s, Lucky Luciano had risen far beyond the grime of the Lower East Side. He was now rubbing shoulders with the old guard Mafia, men like Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, who ruled their empires with an iron hand and an outdated sense of tradition. These were men who clung to the codes of Sicily, where power came from bloodlines, fear, and ritual. To them, loyalty was obedience and innovation was betrayal. Luciano entered their world like a student entering an ancient temple, watching, learning, waiting. He understood that before he could reshape the Mafia, he had to understand it from within. So he played the game. He dressed well, spoke with respect, and never showed his full hand. Outwardly, he was the loyal lieutenant, the charming young don who respected the old ways. But behind his calm demeanor, he was studying everything: how money moved, how orders were given, how mistakes led to bloodshed. Giuseppe Masuria was his first teacher, though not by choice. Joe the Boss ruled the New York underworld with brute force, demanding tribute from anyone who dared do business on his turf. He was arrogant, suspicious, and greedy. To Masuria, the Mafia wasn't an organization, it was a kingdom, and he was its tyrant. Luciano worked for him, but he quickly saw the flaws. Masuria's obsession with control was destroying him. He made enemies faster than he made allies, and his refusal to adapt made his empire brittle. Luciano began to see power in a new way, not as something to be grabbed but something to be managed. Masuria ruled by fear, but fear was temporary. Respect, even among criminals, could last longer. The streets were changing, and Luciano understood that the old methods, vendettas, family honor, blind loyalty, no longer fit the pace of the modern world. The underworld was a business now, fueled by prohibition and organized rackets. It needed structure, not superstition. Then came Salvatore Maranzano, Masuria's rival and the man who would become both Luciano's mentor and victim. Maranzano was different, intelligent, strategic, and steeped in Sicilian history. He spoke of Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire, comparing mob hierarchy to the ancient legions. He wanted order too, but his vision was still rooted in monarchy, a single supreme boss at the top with absolute power flowing downward. He called it Cosa Nostra, our thing. Luciano listened, intrigued but unconvinced. He admired Maranzano's discipline and his focus on structure, but he saw the fatal flaw: absolute power always led to paranoia. Maranzano's empire was just a more polished version of Masuria's, still bound by fear, still doomed to collapse under its own weight. Between these two men, Luciano learned his greatest lessons. From Masuria he learned what not to do: rule by ego, isolate yourself, and trust no one. From Maranzano he learned how to structure an organization: ranks, communication, delegation. But where both failed, Luciano found his opportunity. He envisioned a system that would eliminate the need for constant war, one that would balance power instead of centralizing it. The Castellamarese War between Masuria and Maranzano erupted in 1929, bathing New York in blood. It was a brutal civil war between factions of the Italian Mafia, each trying to seize dominance. Luciano found himself in the middle, but unlike others he saw beyond the immediate conflict. While his peers fought for control, he was thinking about the aftermath. He realized that when two kings destroy each other, the man who builds the peace becomes the true ruler. Luciano began to maneuver in silence. He maintained his role as Masuria's loyal soldier while opening secret lines of communication with Maranzano. He made deals quietly, promising cooperation and profit once the war was over. To his inner circle, men like Lansky, Siegel and Costello, he confided his true goal: to end the chaos, to build something new. He began forming the concept that would later define organized crime: shared power. No more single bosses ruling by fear. Instead, a council, a commission, where the most powerful families would cooperate, arbitrate disputes and divide territories like businessmen, not warlords. It was radical, dangerous and brilliant. But for now he stayed patient. He knew that both Masuria and Maranzano had to fall before the new world could rise. He was still learning, still biding his time, but the outlines of his vision were already clear in his mind. An underworld run like a corporation, with structure instead of superstition, balance instead of blood. Luciano's genius wasn't just his ambition, it was his understanding of psychology. He knew how to make powerful men feel safe, until it was time for them to fall. He smiled in meetings, toasted loyalty, kissed rings and remembered every weakness. He had learned the rules of power, only so he could rewrite them. And soon, the world of Joe the Boss and Maranzano, the world of kings and chaos, would be replaced by something new. Something colder, smarter and far more enduring. The age of the modern mafia was about to begin, and its blueprint was already forming in the mind of a man called Lucky Luciano. The late 1920s in New York were a storm, a brutal, bloody clash for dominance that would decide who controlled the American underworld. It was called the Castellamarese War, and for 2 long years, it turned the city into a battlefield. Behind every cafe door, every alleyway, and every whispered meeting in Little Italy, a war was being waged, not for territory but for the future of organized crime itself. At its center stood 2 titans of the old mafia, Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. Both Sicilian-born, both ruthless, and both obsessed with being the one and only capo dei capi, the boss of bosses. Their feud was more than personal. It was ideological. Masuria represented the old guard, greedy, impulsive and bound by superstition. Maranzano stood for order and discipline, but still rooted in the feudal traditions of Sicily. Between them lay a generation of young gangsters who had grown up in America, sharper, more modern and impatient with the old ways. Leading them was Charles "Lucky" Luciano. For Luciano and his allies, the war was both a curse and an opportunity. The streets ran red with blood as soldiers from both sides were gunned down daily. Restaurants exploded, cars went up in flames, and corpses appeared in gutters as warning signs. Newspapers called it a war of ghosts. No witnesses, no survivors, only names whispered in fear. Business suffered, and prohibition profits dwindled under the weight of endless revenge killings. Luciano, pragmatic as ever, saw the madness for what it was: bad for business. He began to believe that if organized crime were ever to survive, it had to be organized in truth, not just in name. The endless feuds and power struggles were destroying profit and drawing attention from law enforcement. He wanted a syndicate that could unify crime across ethnic lines. Italians, Jews and Irish working together, each controlling their own rackets, but cooperating under one umbrella of peace. But before he could build his new order, the old one had to die. Luciano had pledged allegiance to Masuria as loyalty demanded, but deep down he knew his boss was finished. Masuria's arrogance had alienated his own men, and his greed made him unpredictable. Meanwhile, Maranzano's camp seemed more disciplined, more strategic. Yet Luciano also sensed that Maranzano's hunger for ultimate power made him just as dangerous. It was time to play both sides. Luciano began meeting secretly with Maranzano, offering him a deal: help end the war, eliminate Masuria, and share in the profits of a peaceful, structured underworld. Maranzano agreed, but he underestimated the young man's ambition. Luciano wasn't planning to share power with anyone. On April 15, 1931, Luciano made his move. He invited Masuria to lunch at Coney Island, in a small restaurant named Nuova Villa Tomorrow. The 2 men dined, drank wine and played cards. At one point, Luciano excused himself to the restroom. Moments later, gunfire erupted. 4 of Luciano's trusted allies, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis and Bugsy Siegel, stormed in and riddled Masuria with bullets. The boss of bosses slumped over the table, his hand still clutching an ace of spades. It was over. Or so Luciano thought. In the aftermath, Maranzano declared himself the new Capo dei Capi. He reorganized the Mafia into families, assigning bosses and territories across New York, much like Roman provinces. For a moment, it seemed he might succeed in bringing structure. But Luciano quickly realized that Maranzano's vision was just another monarchy, another empire with one man at the top. And like all kings, Maranzano was already plotting against potential rivals. Whispers reached Luciano that Maranzano planned to have him killed. The old man had grown paranoid, fearing the younger generation's influence. Luciano didn't wait. He struck first. On September 10, 1931, Maranzano summoned Luciano to his office in Manhattan's Park Avenue building, supposedly to discuss business. But Luciano had already learned of the ambush waiting for him there. Instead of attending, he sent a team of assassins, some disguised as detectives, to the meeting. They arrived under the pretense of a police raid, flashed fake badges, and within seconds pulled their guns. Maranzano's men barely had time to draw theirs before it was over. Luciano's rivals were dead, and the last of the old Sicilian bosses lay bleeding on the floor. With those two deaths, Masuria and Maranzano, the old Mafia order crumbled. Luciano had done the unthinkable. He had assassinated the very concept of a boss of bosses. In its place, he would build something entirely new. A democracy of criminals, a corporate structure for crime. For the first time in Mafia history, peace followed blood. The Castellammarese War had killed dozens, perhaps hundreds, but out of its ashes rose a new kind of underworld, one ruled not by fear alone, but by cooperation, efficiency, and profit. Luciano's transformation was complete. He had evolved from street thug to strategist, from follower to architect. The war had taught him that survival meant more than killing your enemies. It meant designing a system where wars no longer needed to happen. In the blood-soaked aftermath of the Castellammarese War, Lucky Luciano stood atop the ruins of the old world. And as he looked down at what remained, he began to imagine the next step, a permanent peace built on permanent control. The world had just witnessed the last great Mafia war of its kind. The next battles wouldn't be fought with Tommy guns and car bombs. They would be fought with meetings, alliances, and profit margins. The age of chaos was over. The age of organization had begun. The year was 1931, and the streets of New York were unnervingly quiet. After 2 years of blood and betrayal, the Castellammarese War had ended, not with a treaty but with two bodies. Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, the old guard of the Sicilian Mafia, were gone. What rose from their ashes would be unlike anything the underworld had ever seen. For decades, organized crime in America had been little more than feudal chaos, a patchwork of petty kings and violent loyalties. Luciano wanted to change that forever. He had witnessed what unchecked ambition could do, how one man's ego could plunge an entire city into war. He wasn't interested in ruling like a tyrant. He wanted to build a system, one that could outlive any single man, including himself. And so, the young gangster with the calm eyes and the scarred face began to sketch his blueprint for control. He called it the Commission, a governing council for the American Mafia, a kind of corporate boardroom for criminals. It was a revolutionary idea. Power distributed, not hoarded. The underworld would be divided into families, each with its own boss, underboss, and consigliere, a counselor to advise and mediate. Every family would run its own operations but cooperate through the commission to avoid unnecessary conflict. Luciano's model mimicked the very structures of legitimate corporations and governments. Instead of one supreme ruler, the Capo dei Capi, there would be balance. Decisions would be made collectively, and disputes would be settled through negotiation rather than violence. Murder would no longer be the first answer, it would be the last resort. The Commission's founding members read like a who's who of underworld legends. From New York came the 5 families: Luciano's own, later called the Genovese family, Joe Bonanno, Tommy Gagliano, Joe Prophesy, and Vincent Mangano. Chicago was represented by Al Capone's powerful Chicago outfit, and other seats were reserved for major families from Buffalo, Cleveland, and Detroit. It was a national network of organized power, the first of its kind. Each family operated independently but under a shared code: cooperation over chaos. Territories were respected, profits were divided, and any dispute too dangerous to settle locally would go before the commission. It was, in essence, a criminal government, one that combined Sicilian discipline with American innovation. Luciano's genius lay in how he sold the idea. He didn't preach peace for morality's sake. He framed it as good business. Wars cost money. Dead men didn't make profits. If the Mafia wanted to thrive in the modern world, with prohibition's billions flowing, with gambling, narcotics, and unions ripe for exploitation, it needed order. And order required structure. The first meeting of the commission was said to be held at a hotel in Chicago in late 1931. There, amid cigars and whispered toasts, the new Mafia order was born. Luciano, though only in his mid-30s, sat at the table like a CEO among shareholders. He had no throne, no crown, but he didn't need one. His authority came from logic. He wasn't the boss of bosses, he was the architect of bosses. For the first time, rival families saw the value of restraint. Murder became regulated, almost bureaucratic. A hit required approval from the commission to ensure it didn't disrupt business or spark unnecessary wars. The rules were simple but ironclad. Keep violence quiet, avoid drawing police attention, and respect the chain of command. The Mafia was no longer a disorganized rabble. It was an invisible empire, humming with precision. And beyond the Sicilian core, Luciano opened doors that had never been opened before. He brought in Jewish mobsters like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, giving them influence through partnerships in gambling, bootlegging, and union racketeering. The American underworld, once divided by ethnicity and mistrust, now functioned as a single machine. Luciano's brilliance was in understanding that money had no nationality. With this new order in place, he redefined what it meant to be a gangster. Gone were the days of loud brutality and public shootings. Luciano demanded discretion. His men wore suits, spoke softly, and operated through fronts and shell companies. The Mafia began to mirror legitimate business in form, even as it remained deeply criminal in substance. Yet beneath this corporate veneer, the old traditions lingered. The commission was still bound by omerta, the code of silence. Betrayal meant death. But unlike before, that death came swiftly, efficiently, and without spectacle. Luciano had given the Mafia its most important gift: a brain. His blueprint spread like wildfire. In the following years, cities across America adopted the same structure: Philadelphia, New Orleans, Kansas City, Los Angeles. Each had its family, all connected through the commission's web. It wasn't just organized crime anymore, it was nationalized crime. Luciano's vision was clear. He wanted to make the Mafia as stable as General Motors, as enduring as Wall Street. He even took cues from legitimate corporations, ensuring that leadership succession was smooth and predictable. If a boss died or went to prison, his underboss stepped up, and business continued uninterrupted. There would be no more wars for succession, at least not openly. But power, even when distributed, never stops hungering. And while the commission brought peace, it also created a new kind of tension: the cold, quiet politics of power. Rivalry simmered beneath the surface. Ambitious men watched and waited. Luciano's empire was efficient, but fragile, dependent on discipline that not all were willing to maintain. Still, for now the system worked. The Mafia was richer and more stable than ever before. The blood-soaked streets of the old era were replaced by boardroom meetings, cigars, and coded conversations. Crime had evolved, from brawls to balance sheets. Lucky Luciano had done what no gangster before him could. He turned the Mafia into an institution. It wasn't just about running rackets anymore. It was about creating an empire that could operate in the shadows of legitimacy, unseen, unshakable, and eternal. What he didn't yet know was that every perfect system carries the seeds of its own destruction. The commission, his masterpiece, would one day protect him, and later destroy him. For now, though, Luciano stood at the height of his power, not as a boss, but as an architect of the underworld's greatest invention. The blueprint was complete. And it worked. By the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano had achieved what no mobster before him dared to dream: peace among killers, order among thieves. The commission had turned chaos into coordination, but peace alone doesn't feed an empire. Money did. And Luciano understood that crime, if managed like a business, could generate more wealth than any legitimate industry in America. The timing was perfect. The United States was deep in the Great Depression, and desperation ran through the veins of the country. But for the underworld, opportunity was everywhere. When honest men went broke, corrupt ones thrived. Politicians, union bosses, and businessmen all needed cash, and Luciano's world was the silent machine ready to provide it for a price. The backbone of Luciano's early fortune came from prohibition. The 18th Amendment had outlawed alcohol, but America's thirst didn't vanish, it went underground. From New York's secret speakeasies to Chicago's lavish gin palaces, bootlegging was a gold rush. Luciano's brilliance was in transforming this dangerous trade into an efficient, industrial-scale operation. He partnered with his old allies, Meyer Lansky, the mathematical mind of the mob, and Frank Costello, the smooth-talking politician in a gangster's suit. Together they built a supply chain that mirrored legitimate business logistics. Booze was smuggled from Canada, shipped through the docks, stored in hidden warehouses, and distributed across the city with military precision. Drivers had set routes, police payoffs were scheduled, and profits were carefully reinvested. It wasn't chaos anymore. It was commerce. Luciano treated his organization like a corporation. Each partner had a division. Lansky handled finance, Costello managed political connections, and Vito Genovese oversaw enforcement. Luciano himself acted like the CEO, coordinating everything through the commission. His innovation wasn't in inventing crime, it was in systematizing it. Under his leadership, the Mafia diversified. Prohibition had made them rich, but Luciano knew it wouldn't last forever. When the ban on alcohol was lifted in 1933, many gangsters panicked, fearing the end of easy money. Luciano didn't. He saw it coming and was already building new revenue streams. Gambling was the next frontier. In New York, illegal betting parlors thrived under Mafia protection. In Cuba, Luciano and Lansky began planning casino operations with the blessing of local officials, planting the seeds for what would later become Havana's glittering gambling empire. Bookmaking, horse racing, and numbers games brought in steady income, far less risky than bootlegging. Then came labor racketeering, perhaps Luciano's most brilliant and sinister enterprise. Through Costello's connections, the Mafia infiltrated labor unions and legitimate industries: dockworkers, trucking, construction, even entertainment. The mob became the silent partner behind entire sectors of the economy. Workers paid dues to corrupt union bosses, who in turn paid tribute to the Mafia. The system worked seamlessly all the way up the chain. Luciano's influence spread into politics. He understood that to truly control the city, he needed leverage over lawmakers. With money flowing freely, envelopes stuffed with cash found their way into the pockets of judges, policemen, and local politicians. Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld, managed these connections like a diplomat, ensuring that raids were rare, arrests were symbolic, and prosecutions often dissolved in thin air. To the public, the Mafia was invisible. To those who knew where to look, its fingerprints were everywhere, in the city's bars, ports, unions, and nightclubs. Luciano had built a parallel economy, one that lived off the inefficiencies of the legitimate world. The Depression hurt Wall Street, but it didn't touch the mob. But what set Luciano apart wasn't just his business sense, it was his vision for scale. He didn't want to dominate one city. He wanted a national network. Through the commission, he expanded operations to Chicago, New Orleans, Kansas City, and Las Vegas. Each city's family ran independently, but all shared the same principles: structure, profit, and cooperation. In a sense, Luciano's empire functioned like a shadow government. It collected taxes, tributes, enforced laws through hits and arbitration, and maintained order where the state couldn't. The Mafia became a system of authority for people who no longer trusted real institutions. In some neighborhoods, Luciano's men provided more justice than the courts. The irony was striking. The Mafia had begun as an anti-establishment force, born from the desperation of immigrants who distrusted authority. Under Luciano, it had become an establishment of its own, disciplined, hierarchical, and, in its own way, respectable. He also understood the importance of image. Unlike the loud, flashy gangsters of the past, Luciano preferred elegance. Tailored suits, quiet speech, and strategic restraint replaced Tommy guns and street brawls. He knew that real power didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed, quietly, absolutely. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano was not just a gangster. He was the CEO of organized crime. His empire stretched across borders, his profits soared, and his system ran so smoothly that few even realized how vast it was. The Mafia wasn't just surviving in America, it was thriving because it had adapted to America. And yet, beneath the surface of this new, polished empire, something darker was stirring. Power, once stabilized, begins to rot from within. Ambition doesn't disappear, it mutates. Luciano's success had made him untouchable, but it had also made him a target. For rivals, for law enforcement, and for the very politicians he thought he owned. The empire was solid. The money flowed. The commission worked. But in the shadows of prosperity, the seeds of downfall had already been planted. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire was at its zenith. On the surface, the streets were calm. The bootleg wars were over, the commission was functioning like a well-oiled machine, and Luciano's name was whispered in nightclubs, courthouses, and backroom offices with equal respect and fear. But beneath that calm, the Mafia's peace was an illusion. A thin layer of order stretched over deep cracks of ambition, betrayal, and paranoia. Every empire, no matter how carefully built, eventually invites challengers. And in Luciano's world, power was never inherited peacefully, it was taken. At the heart of the storm was Vito Genovese, Luciano's second-in-command and the man who had helped him carve order out of chaos. Genovese was ruthless, cunning, and utterly devoid of Luciano's subtlety. Where Lucky preferred diplomacy and structure, Genovese believed in dominance and fear. He watched his boss with admiration tinged with resentment, convinced that one day he should be the one sitting at the top. Luciano sensed it. He had grown up on streets where a man's eyes revealed more than his words. Genovese's loyalty, though outwardly flawless, carried the quiet hum of ambition. But Luciano, ever the strategist, didn't move against him. He understood that in the Mafia, keeping your enemies close wasn't just a proverb, it was survival. Then there was Meyer Lansky, Luciano's lifelong friend and intellectual equal, a man who represented everything the old Mafia wasn't. Jewish by heritage, American by mindset, Lansky was proof that Luciano's new order had transcended ethnicity. Together they had turned crime into an enterprise. But Lansky's loyalty came with one condition: profit over pride. Where Sicilian honor demanded blood for betrayal, Lansky demanded efficiency. The two balanced each other, Luciano's charisma with Lansky's logic. In contrast, Luciano's other associates brought volatility. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Lansky's childhood friend, was the embodiment of chaos. Handsome, fearless and dangerously unpredictable. Siegel was useful. When violence was needed, he delivered with theatrical precision, but his temper made him a liability. Luciano admired his courage but often had to rein him in, reminding him that the new Mafia wasn't about showy violence anymore. And then there were the politicians. Frank Costello, Luciano's bridge to the world of power and influence, operated in the gray zone where crime met government. Through Costello's charm and bribes, the Mafia's money reached deep into the political fabric of New York. Police captains, judges, and even state officials owed favors. Luciano's organization wasn't just buying protection, it was buying legitimacy. But outside his network of allies, enemies were gathering, some visible, others hiding behind the badge of the law. One of the most dangerous was Thomas E. Dewey, the ambitious special prosecutor of New York. Dewey was young, righteous, and utterly relentless. To him, Lucky Luciano wasn't a businessman, he was a symbol of everything wrong with America's moral core. Dewey made it his mission to destroy him. Unlike corrupt officials before him, Dewey couldn't be bought or intimidated. His crusade wasn't about politics, it was about cleansing the system. At first, Luciano dismissed him. Prosecutors had come and gone for years. Dewey seemed like another headline chaser trying to make his name by taking on the Mafia. But Luciano underestimated him. Dewey didn't attack from the usual angles, he didn't go after murders, bootlegging, or gambling. Instead, he targeted something far less glamorous but infinitely more dangerous: prostitution. While Luciano's empire had expanded into unions, racketeering, and gambling, he had also allowed his men to profit from New York's sex trade. It wasn't personal, it was just business. But Dewey saw an opening. He began collecting testimonies from women arrested in brothels, using threats, protection, and promises to build a case that would eventually corner Luciano himself. Meanwhile, within the Mafia, the political tension grew. The commission had brought peace, but it also created a chessboard of shifting alliances. Family bosses in Chicago, Buffalo, and Cleveland began questioning New York's dominance. Genovese quietly courted some of them, whispering about how Luciano had grown too friendly with non-Italians, a veiled insult that appealed to the old-school Sicilians still nursing their pride. The Mafia's golden age was beginning to show its cracks. The same structure that had brought stability now made betrayal more efficient. Every boss had his ambitions, every underboss his schemes. And Luciano, for all his intelligence, couldn't watch everyone at once. There was also the changing landscape of America itself. Prohibition had ended, cutting off one of organized crime's most lucrative lifelines. The Mafia adapted quickly: unions, narcotics, gambling, but each new business brought new risks and new enemies. The public's fascination with gangsters had turned into outrage. Newspapers began portraying men like Luciano not as clever entrepreneurs, but as parasites feeding on America's misery during the Depression. Then came a blow from inside his own circle. In 1936, while Luciano's empire was at full strength, Vito Genovese fled to Italy to avoid a murder charge. Publicly he claimed it was temporary. Privately, Luciano knew what it meant. Genovese was hedging his bets. From across the ocean he began forming alliances with Mussolini's fascist officials, laying the groundwork for his eventual return, and for Luciano's eventual fall. The Mafia's internal politics had become a cold war. Alliances formed over cigars and broken over whispers. Even as Luciano expanded his reach, he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. His empire had grown too large, too complex, too visible. He was now not just the king of crime but a symbol of organized corruption in America. And symbols, sooner or later, have to be destroyed. Thomas Dewey's investigation was tightening. Politicians were growing nervous. Journalists were circling. Inside the commission, rival bosses smelled blood in the water. Luciano's empire still looked unbreakable, but beneath the surface, a silent war was beginning, one that would test everything he had built. In the underworld, enemies rarely announce themselves. They smile at your table, drink your wine, and wait for the moment you blink. And lucky Luciano, for the first time, was about to blink. By 1936, Charles "Lucky" Luciano had reached the pinnacle of power, but with that power came a dangerous illusion, that he was untouchable. He walked through Manhattan like a ghost in a tailored suit, invisible to the public but ever present in the city's pulse. Judges dined on his payroll, cops saluted his cars, and businessmen quietly took his calls. To the world above ground, he was the man who could make or break fortunes with a single nod. But while Luciano saw his empire as eternal, others saw it as a cancer. At the center of the storm stood one man determined to cut it out: Thomas E. Dewey, the relentless New York prosecutor who had made it his personal crusade to destroy organized crime at its roots. Dewey's weapon wasn't muscle or intimidation. It was law, wielded with surgical precision and public theater. 4 months, Dewey had been quietly assembling a team, tracking the labyrinthine network of brothels, gambling dens, and corrupt unions that tied back to Luciano's name. He knew that going after him for murder or racketeering was futile. No witness would dare testify. So he looked where no one else had: the world of prostitution. To the Mafia, it was small change, an unglamorous business compared to bootlegging or gambling. But it was also the one racket where people talked. Women, arrested and terrified, could be pressured. Pimps could be turned. And in a system built on silence, Dewey found the first cracks. His star witness was a madam named Cucky Jarrett, who broke the underworld's code of silence and provided testimony that linked Luciano directly to a vast prostitution syndicate. Under threat of a long prison sentence, she claimed that Luciano not only profited from the business but enforced discipline within it, a claim that, while never conclusively proven, was enough to launch the most famous trial in Mafia history. Luciano was blindsided. He had spent years insulating himself from direct criminal activity. His name was never on contracts, his hands never touched the cash. Every crime passed through layers of intermediaries, a system designed precisely to keep him safe. But Dewey's strategy wasn't about proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt. It was about proving influence. If Luciano controlled the men who ran the rackets, Dewey argued, then he was responsible for the crimes they committed. The arrest came suddenly on April 1, 1936. Luciano was in Hot Springs, Arkansas, resting and enjoying what he thought was temporary peace. Federal agents stormed the hotel, handcuffed him, and marched him through the lobby as photographers flashed their bulbs. The newspapers the next morning screamed, "Vice Czar of New York captured." For a man who had spent years controlling his image, the humiliation was brutal. Lucky Luciano, the elegant architect of organized crime, was dragged into court like a common thug. He had lived by the rule that real power stayed invisible. Now he was the most visible man in America. As he sat in his cell awaiting trial, Luciano's mind became a storm of calculation. He wasn't afraid of prison. He was afraid of betrayal. Someone somewhere had helped Dewey connect the dots. Maybe it was one of his lieutenants, pressured under interrogation. Maybe it was a rival boss eager to see him fall. Or maybe it was Vito Genovese, orchestrating from Italy, pulling strings to remove the one man between him and total power. The whispers began immediately. They got lucky, people said, half in disbelief. Within the Mafia, the reaction was complicated. Some feared that his conviction would bring unwanted heat on everyone. Others quietly saw opportunity. The commission met in secret to discuss his fate, not to plan his rescue, but to decide how to keep business running without him. Meanwhile, Dewey turned the trial into a spectacle. He needed the public to see this as more than just one man's conviction. It was a moral cleansing, a strike against the corruption that had tainted New York for decades. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, curious onlookers, and socialites eager to witness the fall of a king. Luciano sat there, calm, perfectly groomed, with the same poker face that had fooled killers and politicians alike. He whispered to his lawyers, smirked at the press, and occasionally glanced at Dewey with icy detachment. To the public he looked unbothered. Inside, though, he was taking mental inventory, every name, every favor, every weak link that might have betrayed him. His lawyers argued that the witnesses were unreliable, coerced, and inconsistent, and they were right. Many of Dewey's witnesses were prostitutes who had changed their stories multiple times. But the public didn't care about details. They wanted a villain, and Dewey gave them one. The trial dragged on for weeks. The press framed it as the fall of the Mafia king. Each day, Dewey meticulously tied Luciano to his subordinates, painting a picture of a man who ran the city from the shadows, a man whose empire thrived on vice and corruption. The irony was cruel. Luciano, who had built the commission to end unnecessary bloodshed, was now undone not by bullets but by bureaucracy. He had survived gang wars, ambushes, and betrayals, but he couldn't survive paperwork, testimony, and the weight of public morality. As the evidence piled up, Luciano began to see what Dewey truly represented, not just the law but a changing America. The public's tolerance for romantic gangsters was fading. The Depression had hardened people's hearts. They wanted order, not outlaw glamour. By the summer of 1936, the verdict came down, guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The sentence, 30 to 50 years in prison. When the judge read the decision, the courtroom erupted in applause. Outside, crowds cheered Dewey's victory as if he had slain a dragon. Inside, Luciano remained motionless. No anger, no outburst, just a cold, measured calm. He had lost the battle, but in his mind, not the war. As guards led him away, he reportedly muttered to one of his lawyers, "Don't worry. They can lock me up, but they can't lock up the business." It was a prophetic statement. Because even behind bars, Luciano's influence would not fade, it would evolve. The empire he built had grown beyond him, self-sustaining, disciplined, and loyal to the system he created. But as he disappeared behind prison walls, the underworld began to shift. Without its architect, rival bosses repositioned themselves, alliances shifted, and the structure he'd so carefully crafted began to bend under new pressures. Lucky Luciano, the man who turned crime into a corporation, had fallen. But in falling he would prove something remarkable. You could imprison the man but not the machine. The trial of Charles Lucky Luciano began in May 1936, and from the moment the courtroom doors opened, it was clear this would not be an ordinary legal proceeding. It was not just a trial of a man, but of an entire system, a reckoning for the invisible empire that had operated in America's shadows for over a decade. Newspapers called it the case of the century. Every day, the marble halls of the Manhattan Criminal Court filled with journalists, photographers, and curious citizens eager to see the face of the man who had supposedly built the American Mafia. Outside, the streets buzzed with energy. Taxi drivers, newsboys, and shopkeepers all traded rumors. Could Dewey really bring down Lucky Luciano? For Thomas E. Dewey, this was more than a prosecution, it was theater. He had transformed himself into the moral hero of the age. The clean-cut, incorruptible prosecutor facing off against the polished prince of crime. Dewey understood the power of public perception and he used it masterfully. He entered the courtroom with the confidence of a man who knew the nation was watching. Luciano, meanwhile, played his part with equal precision. He arrived every morning immaculately dressed, silk suit, polished shoes, perfectly knotted tie. He didn't fidget, didn't whisper, didn't show emotion. To him, control was power, and he wasn't about to give Dewey the satisfaction of seeing him break. If Dewey was the face of righteousness, Luciano was the face of calm defiance. Behind the scenes, however, the defense team was in chaos. The evidence was circumstantial, built largely on testimonies from prostitutes and pimps, witnesses easily discredited. But Dewey's case didn't rely on hard proof. It relied on narrative. He framed Luciano not as a pimp or thug, but as the mastermind behind a vast network of organized vice. A system of exploitation that spread across New York City. The prosecution paraded witness after witness. Women who described being beaten, threatened, or forced into prostitution by Luciano's associates. Their testimonies were inconsistent and often contradictory, but the emotional weight was devastating. Dewey painted a vivid image, not just of Luciano's guilt, but of moral corruption infecting the city's soul. The defense countered fiercely. Luciano's attorney, George Morton Levy, argued that his client was being tried not for crimes, but for his reputation. My client, Levy thundered, is not on trial for being Italian or successful or feared. He is on trial for crimes that have not been proven. But the words floated into a courtroom already poisoned by presumption. Outside, the media fanned the flames. Headlines screamed, "Luciano's women tell all." Dewey's moral crusade marches on. The newspapers didn't need evidence, they had drama. Each day's testimony was treated like an episode in an ongoing saga, with Luciano as the villain America loved to hate. Even within the underworld there was unease. The commission, while outwardly loyal, had no intention of interfering. They had learned from history, when one man became too powerful, his downfall could drag everyone else down. To them, Luciano's conviction wasn't the end of an era, it was the protection of the system. If Dewey wanted a sacrificial lamb, they would let him have one. In private, Luciano began to understand the depth of his isolation. He had created a system designed to outlive its creator, and now that system was turning its back on him. He had spent years teaching his men that business must continue no matter who fell. Now, that lesson was being applied to him. The trial's most explosive moment came when Dewey personally cross-examined Luciano. It was a duel of intellects, a man of law versus a man of order from the underworld. Dewey questioned him with precision. His business dealings, his connections, his income. Luciano denied everything, his tone steady, his answers measured. When asked if he controlled the city's brothels, he replied coolly, "I never needed to. I make my money elsewhere." The courtroom laughed. Dewey didn't. Luciano's refusal to be rattled frustrated the prosecutor. Dewey wanted a confession, a crack, a moment of arrogance. He got none. Luciano had spent his life mastering the art of silence. What Dewey didn't realize was that Lucky wasn't defending his innocence, he was defending the code. To admit anything would mean betraying everything he had built. Weeks dragged into months. The trial became less about evidence and more about momentum. Dewey's narrative had taken root, that Luciano was not a criminal but a criminal institution. His face, his name, his reputation became shorthand for everything Americans feared about corruption and moral decay. By late June, the end was inevitable. The jury deliberated for less than 9 hours before returning their verdict. Guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The sentence was staggering, 30 to 50 years in state prison, one of the harshest ever handed down for such charges. Dewey stood tall, his reputation cemented overnight. He was hailed as the man who had tamed the Mafia. Newspapers crowned him a national hero, his name whispered as a future presidential candidate. Luciano listened to the sentence in silence. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he simply replied, "I've been convicted of something I've never done, but I'll take it like a man." The courtroom erupted, half in applause, half in shock. Outside, crowds cheered. Inside, Dewey turned to shake hands with his team, already thinking ahead to the political future this victory had secured him. Luciano was led away in handcuffs, his face impassive. But those who looked closely saw something in his eyes, not fear but calculation. He had lost before. He had been beaten, shot, betrayed, humiliated. And yet every time he found a way to rebuild. He understood something Dewey didn't. That power, once earned, doesn't vanish, it mutates. The day after the sentencing, he was transferred to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, a grim fortress known as Little Siberia. It was cold, isolated, and built to break men. Guards whispered that this was where the empire ended, where Lucky Luciano would finally disappear. But they didn't understand him. Luciano didn't see prison as an end, he saw it as another board on the chess game. The commission still existed. His allies still operated. His money still moved. The walls might contain his body, but his mind, and his influence, remained free. In the outside world, Dewey basked in glory while the Mafia quietly adapted. Business continued. The machine ran. Luciano's imprisonment had proven something unexpected. His system worked. The courtroom had destroyed the man but not the structure. The judge had sentenced Lucky Luciano, but what he truly created was the mythology of a man who could not be erased. And as the iron gates of Dannemora clanged shut behind him, Luciano smiled faintly. The world thought he was finished. He knew better. When the gates of Clinton Correctional Facility clanged shut behind Lucky Luciano in the summer of 1936, it seemed as though the great architect of organized crime had finally been buried alive. Clinton, nicknamed Little Siberia, sat in the remote wilderness near the Canadian border, a fortress of stone and steel designed not just to confine but to crush. The winters were merciless, the routines dehumanizing. Prisoners called it the end of the line. But Luciano wasn't like other men. He had built his empire in the shadows, not through muscle but through mind. And even behind bars he understood a truth that had defined his entire life. Power doesn't depend on freedom, it depends on influence. At first the adjustment was brutal. Stripped of his tailored suits and polished shoes, he was given a coarse prison uniform and a number, 92168. The newspapers celebrated his humiliation. Headlines mocked the once king of the underworld, reduced to working in the prison laundry, scrubbing clothes instead of commanding kings. But beneath the stoic surface, Luciano was already calculating. He began small. Guards, bored and underpaid, were easy to charm. Luciano used his natural charisma, a quiet smile here, a favor there. Soon his cell had privileges others didn't: better food, cleaner clothes, cigarettes. Then came influence over inmates, many of whom were small-time crooks, dock workers, and even union men who had once worked for his organization. In prison, Luciano became what he always was: a mediator, a strategist, a man who could get things done. He never bragged, never acted like a boss. Instead, he listened. When prisoners came to him with disputes, he settled them fairly. When guards needed order in a rowdy block, they quietly asked him to handle it. In time, Luciano turned a cold cell block into a microcosm of the order he had built in the world outside. But the true brilliance of Luciano's prison years lay in how he managed his empire without ever leaving his cell. Through a combination of coded letters, visits from lawyers, and messages relayed by loyal lieutenants, Luciano remained in touch with the commission. The structure he'd created years earlier now revealed its genius. The 5 families of New York continued to operate seamlessly, adhering to the chain of command. His trusted partner Frank Costello assumed a quiet leadership role, the prime minister of the Mafia, ensuring that money continued to flow, politicians stayed paid, and the peace among families endured. Luciano's organization had become self-sustaining. His removal had caused no civil war, no chaos. The business moved like a machine, a testament to the blueprint he had designed. Even from a cell 300 miles from Manhattan, Luciano was still the invisible hand guiding the underworld. He communicated through layers of intermediaries. Lawyers brought legal updates that were, in truth, strategic reports. Messages were passed using coded phrases. The crops are good this season meant profits were strong. The weather's changing meant new threats were emerging. Every word mattered. Every phrase was a move on the chessboard. Outside the prison walls, the Mafia flourished. Costello expanded influence in labor unions, Lansky pushed deeper into international gambling, and Genovese, still exiled in Italy, was quietly rebuilding his own power base. Luciano's absence didn't weaken them, it forced them to evolve. And yet, inside his isolation, Luciano wrestled with something he had never faced before: stillness. For a man who had built his life on movement, deals, and strategy, the silence of prison was its own form of torture. He began to reflect, not on guilt or morality but on control. He had built a system so strong it no longer needed him. That realization was both satisfying and terrifying. Occasionally he received visitors, lawyers, friends, even politicians who owed him favors. Each meeting was an exercise in coded communication. The guards heard talk of appeals and paperwork. Beneath the surface, business decisions were being made. Luciano was patient but never idle. In 1937 he learned that Vito Genovese, the underboss who had fled to Italy, was building ties with Mussolini's fascist regime. Genovese had positioned himself as a valuable intermediary between the American Mafia and the Italian underworld, securing heroin routes and protection. Luciano understood immediately: Genovese wasn't just surviving, he was plotting. Luciano's calm exterior masked deep unease. He knew Genovese's ambition better than anyone. The man who had once been his ally would not rest until he reclaimed the throne. And now, with Luciano trapped behind bars, that throne was within reach. To counterbalance this, Luciano doubled down on loyalty from men like Costello and Lansky. They became his voice in the commission, ensuring that Genovese's influence was contained. But the balance was delicate. Every decision made outside prison walls could either secure his legacy or erase it. Still, fate had other plans. In 1942 the world was engulfed in war. America was fighting on multiple fronts, and the government faced an unexpected problem: the security of its own docks. German submarines or U-boats were sinking ships right off the East Coast. Intelligence suggested that Nazi spies were infiltrating the docks of New York, docks largely controlled by the Mafia. The U.S. Navy, desperate and with few options, turned to a man they had once condemned, Lucky Luciano. Through intermediaries, including a high-ranking lawyer and underworld contacts, a deal was proposed. Luciano would use his influence to ensure cooperation from dockworkers and unions, keeping the ports secure and efficient. In return, the government would look favorably upon his sentence. The irony was almost poetic. The U.S. government, which had paraded Luciano as the face of evil, was now asking him to protect the nation from fascists, while his old Lieutenant Genovese served Mussolini in Italy. From behind bars, Luciano orchestrated the agreement. Within weeks, reports confirmed that Mafia cooperation had stabilized the docks. The FBI could never prove the full extent of Luciano's role, but insiders knew. His power had reached from a frozen cell in upstate New York to the heart of America's war effort. By 1945, the war was ending, and with it so was the public's appetite for vengeance. Dewey, now governor of New York, received mounting pressure from various officials, lawyers, and even naval intelligence officers to reconsider Luciano's case. The argument was simple. He had served his time, he had helped the country, and his health was deteriorating. After nearly a decade behind bars, Dewey made a surprising decision. On February 2, 1946, he commuted Lucky Luciano's sentence. Not a pardon but a pragmatic exchange. The price? Deportation. Luciano would be sent back to Italy, never to return to the United States. When Luciano was told, he didn't protest. He simply smiled, lit a cigarette and said, "I built America once. I can build again." As he boarded the ship that would carry him from Ellis Island to Naples, guards and reporters gathered to watch. The man who had once ruled New York's underworld walked calmly, dignified, as though he were heading to another meeting, not exile. He was leaving the country he had conquered, but his influence would not stay behind. His system, his commission, his order, his invisible empire, was still very much alive. In prison, Lucky Luciano had proven his greatest point: you could cage the man but not the mind that built the machine. And now, that machine was about to go global. When Lucky Luciano's ship docked at the port of Naples in 1946, the world had changed beyond recognition. The war had scarred Europe, leaving behind shattered cities and desperate men, the perfect soil for corruption to grow again. Luciano, dressed impeccably as ever in a tailored overcoat and fedora, stepped onto Italian soil not as a returning son, but as an exile, a man stripped of his empire, forced to begin again. The crowd that greeted him wasn't made of family or friends, but of journalists and police. In the eyes of Italy, he was an American gangster, a man too dangerous for his own country. The government watched him like a hawk, and the Mafia in Sicily, older, more rooted in tradition, regarded him with suspicion. To them, Luciano was a foreigner, an Americanized upstart who spoke the language of business, not honor. Yet, as always, Lucky adapted. He rented a villa outside Naples and began to move quietly. He still had money, plenty of it, hidden in accounts and investments in the pockets of men who owed him. And more importantly, he still had connections. His old associates in New York, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and others, kept him informed through coded telegrams and visitors who came under the guise of businessmen. But for the first time in his life, Luciano wasn't in control. He could influence but he couldn't command. He was like a chess master forced to play from the sidelines, watching others move his pieces. Still, exile did not mean irrelevance. Luciano had been expelled from America, but his blueprint, the commission system, was alive and thriving. The Mafia families in New York continued to operate under his design. Even from afar, his word carried weight. When disputes arose between families, envoys still whispered, "What would Charlie say?" Yet beneath this illusion of stability, the criminal world was changing. The golden age of prohibition was over. The new frontier was narcotics, and the global heroin trade offered profits that dwarfed anything Luciano had ever imagined. From his villa in Naples, Luciano began to see the possibilities. Southern Italy, with its impoverished villages and old Mafia networks, was perfectly positioned as a hub for smuggling. The raw materials came from the Middle East, were refined in Europe, and shipped across the Atlantic to America. It was the birth of the French Connection, a heroin pipeline that would dominate the 1950s and 60s. Luciano didn't run it directly, not at first. But his old associates, particularly Lansky and certain Sicilian intermediaries, knew the game. Luciano became a facilitator, a connector between the American syndicates and the old Mafia families of Italy. He offered the blueprint, the structure, and the trust that no one else could. He told one associate, "I built something that doesn't need me to live, but it listens when I whisper." Still, the years of exile wore on him. He missed the streets of New York. The lights, the noise, the sense of purpose. In Italy he was both revered and resented. He had money but not power. He had influence but not territory. Every letter from America reminded him of what he'd lost: the empire, the respect, the control. By the early 1950s, he was under near constant surveillance by Italian and American authorities. Every meeting, every visitor, every phone call was recorded. The American press had begun to treat him as a ghost, the retired king of crime, rumored to still pull strings from the shadows. In reality, he was a man aging in solitude, pacing the marble floors of his villa, haunted by the machinery he'd built. Then came the betrayal that confirmed his deepest fear. Vito Genovese, the man he had long distrusted, had returned to America and seized control of his former empire. Genovese, ruthless and cunning, had maneuvered his way to the top of the commission, declaring himself the true boss of bosses. Luciano saw it clearly for what it was: the final act in a long war between vision and vanity. Genovese had always wanted absolute control. Luciano had always wanted balance. Now the old equilibrium was collapsing. The organization he had created to prevent bloodshed was once again fracturing under ambition. In his letters to Lansky, Luciano wrote cryptically, "We built a machine and now it runs without mercy." Even as he faded from power, Luciano's legacy deepened. The Mafia of the 1950s, the corporate-style empire that controlled unions, casinos, and narcotics, was a direct extension of his vision. The commission had become the unseen boardroom of organized crime, coordinating territories and profits across continents. But Luciano's final years were marked by paranoia. The walls of his villa felt like a cage. He drank more, smoked constantly, and grew suspicious of everyone. The police hounded him. Agents followed him through Naples like shadows. Even legitimate visitors were questioned and harassed. And yet, he never stopped scheming. In 1957 he saw an opportunity to reclaim relevance, not through violence but through diplomacy. The Havana Conference, held in Cuba, was his grand reappearance. There, Mafia leaders from across the United States and Latin America gathered to discuss narcotics, gambling, and the future of organized crime. Luciano, though officially barred from U.S. soil, made his way to the island through secret channels, arriving as a living legend. In Havana he was greeted not as a fugitive, but as a founding father. The great names of organized crime, Lansky, Trafficante, Costello, and others, treated him with reverence. The atmosphere was electric, almost reverential. For a few fleeting days, Luciano was again the center of gravity. He spoke quietly but with authority, reminding them of the purpose behind the system he had created: order, cooperation, profit without chaos. "We built something," he said, "that should outlast all of us, if you remember the rules." But the moment didn't last. U.S. authorities discovered his presence and demanded his expulsion from Cuba. Under pressure, the Cuban government forced him back to Italy. It was the last time he would ever hold court among his peers. Back in Naples, Luciano withdrew from public life. He was aging, tired, but still sharp. He often reflected on his paradoxical life: a man who brought structure to chaos, yet lived in exile because of it. He had wanted power without blood, loyalty without fear, and instead he had created an empire that fed on both. In his final days he began meeting with film producers who wanted to tell his story. He saw it as a chance to shape his legacy, to control the narrative just as he had once controlled the underworld. He believed he could explain himself, humanize himself, maybe even find redemption through art. But fate, as always, intervened. On January 26, 1962, Luciano met one of those producers, Martin Gosch, at Naples International Airport. They spoke briefly, shook hands, and as Luciano turned to leave, he collapsed suddenly, a heart attack. He died instantly on the cold marble floor, surrounded by police and bystanders who recognized him only as a myth come to life. In his pocket, they found a rosary and a small envelope containing the outline of a film deal, his final attempt to tell his own story. In a twist of irony, the Italian government that had watched him so closely allowed him one final mercy: to be buried in the United States. Thousands attended his funeral in Queens. The old guard of the Mafia sent flowers. The new generation came in silence, to pay homage to the man who had designed their world. Lucky Luciano died without a kingdom, but his creation, the modern Mafia, had outlived him. His exile had stripped him of his throne, but it had also proven the strength of his vision: an empire that didn't need its king to survive. In death, as in life, Charles Lucky Luciano remained both a ghost and a blueprint, the man who built a system that refused to die. When Lucky Luciano's coffin was lowered into the cold earth of St. John's Cemetery in Queens, it was more than the burial of a man, it was the sealing of an era. Above him lay marble angels and family headstones. Below him rested the architect of a system that still pulsed beneath the streets of every major city. The mourners were a mix of silence and whispers, old gangsters in black coats, government men watching from cars, and younger faces who had inherited the empire he built but never truly understood the weight of it. Luciano's death didn't end his story. It merely confirmed it. The system he had created, the commission, the corporate-style mafia, had already outgrown him. His true legacy was not in the bullets he ordered or the fortunes he made, but in the order he imposed on chaos. Before Luciano, organized crime in America had been a storm, a swirl of ethnic gangs, family vendettas and senseless killings. He transformed that storm into a network, disciplined, efficient and terrifyingly stable. He replaced loyalty born of blood with loyalty born of profit. He gave criminals a constitution, rules and hierarchy, the illusion of civility masking an empire of corruption. It was in every sense his masterpiece. And like all great architects, Luciano's creation lived far longer than he did. In the years following his death, the Mafia thrived under his design. The five families of New York continued to operate as independent entities, united under the balance of the commission, just as Luciano had envisioned. When disputes arose, the bosses met not in back alleys but in quiet restaurants and hotel suites, settling issues with diplomacy instead of war. The bloodshed that had once stained the streets of Manhattan gave way to something colder, business meetings disguised as peace. But the paradox of Luciano's blueprint was that it carried within it the seeds of its own decay. He had built a system meant to avoid chaos, yet it demanded constant maintenance. Every generation that followed understood less about the philosophy behind it. To them, the commission was power, not balance. Money, not structure. By the 1970s, that misunderstanding began to show. The Mafia had grown too big, too visible. Its influence in unions, construction, and Las Vegas casinos had become impossible to ignore. The FBI, once blind to its inner workings, finally began to see the architecture Luciano had built. And in that revelation came its undoing. Through wiretaps, undercover agents, and the landmark RICO Act, the U.S. government began dismantling the very structure that had kept the Mafia alive for half a century. Bosses were imprisoned, families fractured, and the commission, the crown jewel of Luciano's design, collapsed under the weight of exposure. And yet, even as the house crumbled, the blueprint remained. Modern organized crime, from drug cartels in Mexico to syndicates in Russia and Asia, follows Luciano's principles almost verbatim. Hierarchical leadership, compartmentalized cells, business-like profit sharing, codes of silence and loyalty. Every system that thrives on power without transparency owes something, directly or indirectly, to the lessons of Lucky Luciano. He turned crime into an institution, a system that mimicked government, economics, and even religion. There were rules, rituals, and a sense of purpose that made the underworld seem almost legitimate. That was his genius, and his curse. Psychologically, Luciano represented something deeper than a mob boss. He was the embodiment of modern ambition, pragmatic, amoral, efficient. He didn't believe in good or evil, only in control. His morality was mechanical, a worldview where the ends justified the means as long as order was preserved. He often said, "Everybody wants to be a gangster, until it's time to do gangster things." But to him, being a gangster was never about violence, it was about organization. That detachment, that ability to turn human lives into systems, morality into mathematics, was both his brilliance and his damnation. He was a man who sought to replace chaos with logic, yet created an empire where logic served chaos. Luciano's influence even reached the culture that condemned him. Hollywood mythologized him. The Godfather films, Goodfellas, Boardwalk Empire, all bear his fingerprints. The calm, calculating Don who values order over rage, who holds meetings instead of wars, that archetype was born from him. He turned the Mafia into something almost philosophical, a reflection of the American dream twisted into the underworld. He had once said, "There's no difference between a businessman and a gangster, only the laws." That line became the unofficial manifesto of an entire generation of mobsters and hustlers. It captured his understanding that America's moral core was built on ambition, and that ambition, unchecked, was indistinguishable from crime. In a way, Lucky Luciano wasn't just a criminal, he was America's mirror. He saw that the system of capitalism, competition, hierarchy, loyalty, betrayal, was no different from the Mafia, only cleaner in appearance. He industrialized crime in the same way America industrialized business. And in doing so he created something timeless. Today his name still carries weight in places he never lived to see, whispered in films, history books, and among modern crime syndicates who still use his methods without knowing their origin. He is both ghost and architect, myth and manual. But perhaps the most haunting part of Luciano's legacy is the question it leaves behind. The same question that echoes in every system built on power: can control exist without corruption? Luciano believed it could. He thought that by creating balance he could end the chaos of endless wars. But history proved otherwise. His order didn't end crime, it only perfected it. His commission didn't prevent bloodshed, it delayed it. His empire didn't die with him, it metastasized. And yet, even in failure there is a strange admiration. Because in his own way, Lucky Luciano succeeded at what few men ever do. He changed the rules of his world and forced history to remember him. He wasn't the strongest or the most feared. But he was the most strategic. The quiet genius who looked at a fractured underworld and saw the outline of a system that would last for generations. As one FBI agent later remarked, "You can arrest 100 gangsters but you can't arrest an idea." That idea, of order, discipline and shared power in the shadows, was Luciano's gift to the world he corrupted. In the end, Lucky Luciano didn't just build a crime empire. He built a template for power itself. And that, more than money, fame or fear, is what made him immortal. As the dust of decades settles, the story of Lucky Luciano stands at the crossroads between myth and morality, a parable about power, control, and the thin line that separates civilization from crime. His name endures not merely as a historical figure but as an archetype, the modern Machiavelli who built an empire from the gutter and ruled it with a businessman's mind and a criminal's heart. To understand Luciano is to confront the uncomfortable truth about human nature, that ambition and morality rarely coexist peacefully. He was not a monster, nor was he a hero. He was a man who understood systems, political, social, psychological, and bent them to his will. Where others saw chaos, he saw opportunity. Where others clung to tradition, he engineered innovation. He rose from the immigrant slums of New York, a world of poverty, prejudice, and desperation, and through cunning alone, reshaped an entire criminal landscape. But the brilliance that built his empire was also what destroyed it. Luciano believed he could control everything: men, money, morality, fate. Yet, in the end, even he could not escape the machine he created. The Mafia after Luciano became a reflection of his paradox: disciplined yet corrupt, powerful yet doomed. His commission was meant to end the bloodshed of the old world, but it became a parliament of predators, each one learning to smile as they sharpened their knives. The peace he created was an illusion, sustained only as long as men feared chaos more than they desired power. And perhaps that was the truest lesson Luciano ever taught, that power is never conquered, only borrowed, and every empire, no matter how organized, eventually devours itself. Cinematically, his story feels almost biblical. A boy born into hardship rises to command kings and criminals alike, defies governments, outwits lawmen, and dies alone, not in a blaze of glory but quietly, of natural causes, his mind still working until its last breath. The gangster who could not be killed by bullets was finally undone by time. Yet even in death he achieved what few men ever could: immortality. His systems, his strategies, and his vision of a structured underworld became templates for criminal empires across continents. The global drug trade, international cartels, political corruption networks, all echo Luciano's design. He turned chaos into enterprise. But beyond the structure and the strategy lies something more human: the psychology of Charles Lucky Luciano. He was not driven by cruelty but by control. He did not crave fame but stability. Deep down he was not trying to destroy society, he was trying to build his own version of it. A world where loyalty replaced law and profit replaced principle. In that sense, Luciano's legacy reaches far beyond organized crime. His story mirrors the evolution of power itself, from raw violence to organized systems, from fear to strategy. Governments, corporations, and even digital empires today run on similar principles: hierarchy, loyalty, secrecy, control. The difference is only in legality. That's what makes his story timeless. Luciano forces us to question whether the moral difference between a mob boss and a corporate CEO is simply the side of the law they stand on. Both manage loyalty. Both punish betrayal. Both trade in influence and perception. Both build machines that run on ambition, and often corruption. In the end, the hidden blueprint wasn't just for a crime empire. It was for power itself: how to build it, how to hold it, and how it inevitably consumes those who believe they can master it. The man who began as a street kid with torn shoes ended as a figure whose ideas reshaped the underworld, law enforcement, and even the language of power. His fingerprints are everywhere, from the boardroom to the back alley, from government backdoors to global cartels. And perhaps that's the ultimate irony. Luciano wanted control, yet his greatest creation, the modern Mafia, became uncontrollable. It evolved beyond him, multiplied, adapted, and infiltrated every corner of the world, long after his heart stopped beating in that Neapolitan airport. Today, when historians, criminologists, or filmmakers revisit his story, they find not just a gangster, but a reflection of the human condition. Our endless hunger for order amid chaos, our need for systems to justify our sins. Lucky Luciano may have built his empire on crime, but he also built a mirror, one that still reflects the uneasy truth about power and morality in every age. He once said, "There's no such thing as good money or bad money. There's just money." That line, simple and cold, could serve as his epitaph, a summary of the world he saw so clearly, one without heroes or villains, only players and rules. And as the final credits roll on his life, the boy from Sicily, the king of New York, the exile in Naples, one truth lingers like smoke over a poker table. Charles Lucky Luciano didn't just change the Mafia. He changed the definition of power itself. He built a machine that outlived him, and in doing so ensured that his ghost, the ghost of order within chaos, would haunt the corridors of power for generations to come.